In this video tutorial for Tic-Tac-Toe, I'm going to help you get started by showing you how to create a grid, which we're going to use a two-dimensional array to represent a grid, and I'm going to show you how to initialize it, meaning give it some starting values. I'm going to show you how to display all those values in a grid-like format, and then I'm going to show you how you can access a particular cell on this grid and get its value, or change its value, set a new value for it. Okay, so first let's learn how to create a 2D array. If you remember from the previous video, we learned how to create a one-dimensional array, right? It would be something like this. We could say char, brackets, and then give it a name, new char, and then the size of the array in here. So we could say store 3 items in this array. Well, a 2D array is very similar. We just have to add another dimension. And instead of calling it characters, let's call it grid. Take a closer look at the end right here. Instead of just having one set of brackets that says 3, now we have 2. So the first one represents how many rows are in this grid. The second one represents how many columns are in this grid. So basically it's saying I have 3 rows of 3 columns each, which looks something like this. Obviously, that works perfectly if we're trying to create tic-tac-toe, right? You have 3 rows and 3 columns. Okay, now we need to learn how to initialize that grid, meaning we need to give it some values. So each of those spots that we've just allocated memory for can hold a value, and specifically they can hold a character value. So let's try putting a character somewhere in that grid. Let's try putting a character in the first row and the first column. So we would say 0th row and 0th column equals the character x. And because we're dealing with a character value rather than a string value, we need to use single quotes instead of double quotes. Really quickly, let's make sure that it actually stored the value x inside that spot. So I'll just print out the value at spot 0, 0 is, and then say grid 0, 0. And if I click run, this is our output. This is the value at spot 0, 0 is x. So it looks like it worked. Okay, well let's try initializing the rest of the grid. And instead of making it x, let's actually just make it an empty character. Let's say like just the space character. Now you might notice I didn't use the indices 1, 2, and 3 to access the first, second, and third row and column. I used the indices 0, 1, and 2. That's because we start counting with 0 whenever we're looking at the indices in a list. So we allocated memory for 3 rows and 3 columns, which means the first row is 0, the first column is 0, the last row is 2, and the last column is 2. The next thing I want to show you is how to display those values in a grid-like format. And this is going to take some creativity. In fact, this whole project can be done in a number of different ways. But let's make a new function. Let's call it display. So public static void display grid. And then we'll have it take a char two-dimensional array and call that also grid. So anytime we use this function, we're going to have to pass the grid to it so it knows what values to display. The easiest way I can think of to display all of this data in a grid format is to use a nested for loop. So we could have an iterator I that goes over all the rows, and then an iterator inside that goes over all the columns. And then we simply display the value at the current row and column. Now, there's something wrong with this, and I'll show you in a second. Let's call that function and see if it works. We have to pass in grid. And before we run it, let's actually get rid of this code. We don't need to display that one line anymore. So this will print out the values in the grid. It's actually very boring what it displayed, and you can't see anything because it's all spaces and they're all on their own lines. So instead of making these spaces, for now, let's actually give them values. Let's say x, o, x. Okay, so if we print that out, we have one column that is 9 characters tall. Or you might say we have 9 rows that are one column each. Anyway, that's not what we want, obviously. Inside of here, we don't want to actually print each value on a new line. But we do want to go to a new line after each row. So before I do that, run it again just to show you. Now everything is all in the same row, right? So we just say as soon as each row is done, if you remember, each row gets printed with the inside for loop. When that is done, we simply print out an empty line. Okay, now we'll get a nice grid format. So we've got X's and O's in a grid. Let's say you wanted to make it a little bit more fancy. Instead of having the characters just bunched up next to each other, we could add in a pipe character in between. So let's try this. Now this might do something kind of annoying. Maybe that's what you're looking for. If you don't want it to show on the last one, we could just say only go to column 2 and then print out column 3 manually, not using the loop. So if that's what you're going for, then you can use that code. If you wanted to put dashes in between each row, we could do that pretty easily. We could say system.out.print dash 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 dash, something like that. See what that looks like. That doesn't really look that great, but maybe if we remove the bottom one, it'll look a little better. So we could just say only print this out for the first 2 rows, and then manually print out the 3rd row, which would mean copying and pasting all of that except for the line underneath. And then the I, of course, it's the 3rd row, which means it's spot 2. All right, and then we print it. And it looks pretty good, except we probably didn't need that many dashes. There we go. So if that's what you want your tic-tac-toe grid to look like, here's the code to get that. It doesn't need to be that fancy though. All right, and the last thing on here, we've already kind of learned how to get the values. In fact, when we're displaying the values, we're getting each individual value. But if you wanted to learn how to get the values and set the values according to how the people were playing, we could change these values very easily depending on whatever the user chooses, right? In fact, when it starts out, this should just be spaces, right? So this will look a little bit better for the starting. Okay, we've got an empty tic-tac-toe grid just waiting for us to put values in it. So you could make a while loop around this. You could say while true, or except instead of saying while true, you should probably come up with a condition where you check whether somebody has already won the game. So while that's the case, it'll keep displaying the current state of the grid, and then it'll ask each player where they want to go in the grid. So I can make a variable called player 1's row choice. And I could set it equal to whatever the scanner gives me. I could create a scanner. Let's just pretend that they typed a 1. Let's say they typed a 2 for the column choice. Then whatever they chose, I could just say something like grid at P1 row choice and P1 column choice equals X, because if they're player 1, they're putting down an X. Then I could do the same thing with player 2. But before that, I'd probably want to display what the grid looks like. Let's just run this to show what it looks like. And it's going on forever because it's not asking them for input. So let's actually create a scanner then. Equals s.next int and s.next int. And let's tell the user, let's say player 1, which row and column do you choose? And then we might as well also do that for player 2. So after we display the grid again, we'll say player 2, which row and column do you choose? And we could say P2 row choice and P2 column choice. And set that value to be an O. So let's restart this. It says player 1, which row and column do you choose? We'd say 1, 2. And it puts an X there. And then it says player 2, which row and column do you choose? I say 0, 0. And it puts an O right there. I hope that's enough to help you get started. What you still have to do is you have to figure out when somebody has won so that you can end the game. You also have to make sure somebody doesn't try to go somewhere that's already taken. And if you have questions, of course, I'm more than happy to help, so let me know in class. Good luck.